いや、雨の中、皆様、お忙しい中、私どもの企画であります、リアラインの出版記念セミナーに参加いただきまして、本当にどうもありがとうございます。私はこの主催元の NT データ経営研究所の社長をしております、山口と申します。よろしくお願いいたします。今回のこの企画でございますけれども、まずは、大変、興味深い本を書かれました、ジョネサン・トレバー先生に、お礼申し上げたいと思います。We are very honored to publish your thoughtful book in Japanese. また、この本を出版するにあたりまして、簡約を引き受けていただいた池上先生にもお礼申し上げたいと思います。本当にどうもありがとうございます。また、この企画を実行するにあたりまして、協賛いただきましたオックスフォード大学と特別協賛いただきました日本政策投資銀行の方々、本当にどうもありがとうございます。また出版いただきました東洋経済出版社の方にもお礼申し上げたいと思います。少しこの私どもがこの本を出版するような経緯、出版できるようになった経緯というのを少しお話しさせていただければと思います。トレバー先生のところで学んでいましたミキさんという方が私どもお知り合いでございまして、ミキさんが私どもの石塚にですね、トレバー先生の本を紹介してくれました。で、私ども読まさせていただいて大変興味深い本だと思ったところでございます。で、その後、また知り合いでありました池上先生にこの件は一切話さずにお話しすると池上先生がいい本があるよということで、このトレバー先生の本を紹介いただきました。そうするとこれはもう私ども日本の読者さんにですね、紹介するしかないということで、これはいいチャンスだということを思いました。それでですね、昨年の9月に私どもの今日パネルディスカッション出ます浦野と、常務であります浦野と石塚がオックスフォード大学を訪問いたしまして、それで、この先生の主張されているところを十分理解し、より的確に訳していけるだろうということで、この翻訳プロジェクトがスタートしたわけでございます。で、NT データ経営研究所の中にですね、チームがございまして、このビジネスストラテジーコンサルティングユニットというところと、クロスインダストリーファイナンスコンサルティングユニットというユニットがございまして、このユニットからメンバーを選びまして、リアライン研究チームというのを組成いたしまして、この本の読み解きをするとともに日本のビジネスリーダーに理解いただけるように翻訳するということ。また、池上先生にはですね、戦略論、組織論の観点からアドバイスいただいて、日本の読者の方に分かりやすくできるんではないかということで進めてきたわけでございます。で、この本の中もですね、より日本の読者の方に理解いただきやすいように、池上先生、トレバー先生、池上先生、また私どもの若手のコンサルタントが入りまして、定談という形で収録させていただいております。で、トレバー先生については池上先生の方から詳しいご紹介あると思いますので、こういう経緯でこの本が出版されたということをご紹介させていただきました。最後に少しだけ私ども NTT データ経営研究所がこういう活動をしているということを少しご紹介させていただければと思います。次のページお願いします。私ども NTT データ経営研究所というのはシンクタンクでもないし、単なるコンサルをやってるわけでもなく、ちょうどこの中間、両方やってるという会社でございます。では次お願いします。そういう形で、この社会公共のところにはコンソーシアム型のコンサルをし、またはフィールドコンサルということで中央省庁が実施される施策の支援をやったりしております。また、法人、金融の世界では、フォーサイトコンサルということとか、お客様の成果が出るまで伴走型をやるというようなサービスをやっております。次お願いします。というような形で次お願いします。で、私ども、このように海外のですね、DX に優れた見識をお持ちの先生の本を日本に紹介するということを集中的にこの1年ぐらい取り組んできておりまして、こういう本も 翻訳出版するところでございます。で、上の方はちょうどもう出版したところでございます。下の方については今、翻訳中でございまして、年末から来年、年度末ぐらいにかけてですね、出版させていただくことでございます。ということで今日ですね、本当に皆さんお忙しい中お集まりいただきまして、で、トレバー先生の理論をご紹介させていただいて、大変有意義な会になればという具合に思っておりますので、よろしくお願いします。本当に今日はありがとうございます。よろしくお願いいたします。
Well, firstly, I would just like to say thank you so much for the very warm welcome, for the tremendous hospitality, but also for the opportunity to come here and share with you some thoughts. To share with you some thoughts around this topic of alignment. And in many respects, this is the celebration of the launch of the Japanese edition of Realign, but I would also like to position it as the celebration of many collaborations with wonderful organizations such as NTT Data, such as DBJ, such as with Professor Ikegami at Waseda, and indeed many, many friends that I have made here in my time. I calculated the other day approximately 50 visits to Japan in the last 20 years, starting with a research interest at Cambridge University. I must apologize, even though I have visited 50 times for both business and pleasure. I'm afraid I do not speak Japanese, and I'm very sorry. But I plan to learn, I promise. I say that every time. But really what I would like to do is share with you a little bit of insight about why I became interested in this topic, why specifically I became interested in this topic of alignment, and how that then became the book that you have in front of you, Realign, and what the key ideas are. And I believe these are issues which are relevant for all organizations in every sector all across the world. My initial interest in the topic of business and management really started with my first undergraduate lecture about this topic of management, which was not really very well understood by me, at least. But I remember sometimes you hear something and it just becomes extremely fascinating, extremely interesting. And the topic was interesting for me. Specifically, this idea of organizations as being central to our success, both economically but also socially, how we should think about them, and how it is that we make them successful. And what was most interesting to me was that despite much research, there were not clear answers. My professors, when I was much younger, did not have clear answers. So when I was very young, maybe just 20 years old in university, I wanted to understand, how do organizations work? And I asked my professors, who were probably the same age that I am now, Professor, how does it work? And they gave an answer, and honestly, I found it a little bit unsatisfying. And at that point, my curiosity was ignited. How do organizations work, whether they are startups, mature organizations, whether they are British organizations or Japanese organizations, whether they are banks or whether they are telecommunication companies? How do these things work? And what for me was most interesting was this idea that all organizations share the same definition, but it looks very different in practice. And one of the key aspects of what makes the difference between a successful organization and an unsuccessful organization is this topic of alignment, which we didn't really understand. So forgive me, for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to be your professor and I'm going to lecture you. Please forgive me. All organizations are defined by the same common definition. They are collections of individuals and groups of people acting together in order to achieve a common aim. But this definition reflects how we want organizations to operate ideally. We want them to have a clear purpose. We want them to employ people who are capable of implementing that purpose. We want them structured in such a way that they can encourage cooperation. And we also want them to have engagement in that purpose and commitment and loyalty. But the reality is that many organizations across many sectors are not characterized by that alignment behind a common purpose. They are in fact characterized by a second definition, which is not ideal, but rather practical or realistic, which is that they are collections of individuals and groups of people who act together in order to achieve their various aims, not necessarily a common purpose or a common aim, but different aims. And this is very fascinating to me, and we can think about this in a more structured way. And that is how I've tried to essentially focus my academic work, but also my practical work, working with companies. Please, may we have the next slide? Thank you. We can think of all organizations essentially as continuums, which at one end have a state of alignment, and at the opposite end have a state of what we would think of as misalignment. Highly aligned organizations benefit in performance terms from having a clear unity of purpose, shared vision, superior engagement by their people. They have high levels of trust, commitment, and loyalty. It is easier to establish collaborations and to create value greater than the sum of the parts. They are more coherent, or as JJ mentioned, more congruent. They have the ability to span across different verticals and create this value through synergies. And they are also more open to external influences and more open to change as well. The COVID-19 pandemic was a test in many respects, a test of many assumptions that we had, a test of many organizations. Highly aligned organizations, ones which had this clarity of purpose, had people who are engaged in that purpose, were more resilient and more sustainable. And one of the interesting research findings that we found at Oxford was that highly aligned organizations were not only more resilient in the face of COVID-19 and all of the disruption, they were also the quickest to start post-pandemic strategic planning. They started to think about the future in the middle of the crisis and not wait until the end of the crisis. Why? Because in many respects, they had the luxury of that bandwidth that comes from having regular conversations about the state of the organization and its future direction. And in many respects, they enjoyed the luxury of having perhaps more resiliency. Misaligned organizations, on the other hand, typically often exhibit conflicting interests between different groups, between different layers of management, between employer and employees, or indeed between different divisions. You can see this in terms of passive conflict or even active conflict. When I come to Japan, including this visit, every single time I talk about Japan Rail, I feel the need to talk about Japan Rail because I love it. And I want to tell everybody that I love it. And I love it because every day in the UK, I use British Rail, and the experience is not the same. And in many respects, the experience is not the same precisely because of alignment. By the way, Japan Rail, highly aligned and high performing. British Rail, maybe not so much. I'll be diplomatic. But misaligned organizations often lack clear vision or direction. They often have little commitment to shared objectives. They often have high turnover of staff, and indeed often experience a poor strategy execution, there is a gap between what they intend to do and what they are actually able to do. And all of this ultimately results in poor performance and inefficiency. And certainly, again, coming back to the example of COVID-19, many poorly aligned organizations were the first to need support or indeed to fail completely. We see that typically within an industry, for example, there is often a distribution of organizations. Industry leaders are often few and they experience above industry average performance. Then there are those which are on a tail and experience relatively poorer performance. And we can see this distribution more or less across every industry, everywhere in the global economy. Alignment is the difference between high performance and low performance. So what generates alignment? And this is really where the focus of my work has been. How should we think about it? Who is responsible for it? And it's through my work here in Japan and elsewhere that really the inspiration or the idea for Align originally, the book that was published in 2019, then Realign in 2022, and then finally Realign Japanese edition today, really found its inspiration and its motivation to try and understand how organizations can go from the right to the left and sustain their position as well. And that's really been the focus. And we can see that this is a common and enduring leadership challenge, and leadership is the difference. We can see that over a sustained period of time, there have been very many changes to how it is that we think about the operating environment. In particular, how we think about business and organizations and organizational effectiveness. The very big narrative that academics are concerned with is this idea of the shift from the bureaucratic, hierarchical organization to something which is more post-bureaucratic, more information age relevant, more open and more flexible. We can see a progression over the past 100 years from this idea of having organizations which are very hierarchical, formal, with clear verticals, divisions of labor, and really focused on efficiency and efficiency and execution, cost management, and economies of scale, to organizations which are increasingly focused on openness, maybe some integration across different departments or different teams to find synergies, to more recently, and these are just examples of workplaces as expressions of this type of change in thinking, which are more open. The workplace resembles something more like Starbucks than it does a traditional office, but it represents something around the informality that we associate with work being centered around perhaps the individual, to more recently the ultimate expression of work, which was in the pandemic by necessity incredibly flexible in terms of space and time, where we work and when we work, but also very individualistic. We can see that there has been a shift over time from control through hierarchy and authority, which is formal, to increasingly work which is informal, at least in the office, at least for knowledge work. But this is a misleading story to see that it's simply a progression over time, because I think part of what creates misalignment in organizations is a lack of understanding that it is not simply that we've gone from hierarchy to open office, from open office to something like WeWork, from WeWork to hybrid work, for example, and the organizations that support that. All of these models are valid. All of them still continue. Affordability and cost management, control and governance is still as important today as it always was. The ability to maximize economies of scale are still as important as they always were, even 100 years ago. It's just that now organizations have to be capable of many more things, including openness, being accepting of external ideas, being open to external partnerships, being able to source innovation and convert it into meaningful product and service innovation, of being flexible and being able to connect across different verticals in order to capture synergistic value, or indeed be able to operate as a multinational enterprise. The world of business, whether it was Western Europe, the US, or Japan, was one that was relatively predictable, stable, and I will say simple. Never easy, but simple. And there was one dominant model. We now live in a world where there is no longer simply one dominant model. We have 4 potential options, 4 ways in which we can create alignment in organizations and performance. And as JJ said earlier, one thing I am famous for, if I'm famous for anything, which is very small, is the catchphrase, "It depends." I am Professor It Depends, because I believe it is honest. Which is the best model? Many people have different opinions, but there is only one honest answer, and the answer is, it depends. It depends. And so if it depends, then the challenge becomes, how do we decide as organizations? How do we decide the model or the form which works best for us? And how do we decide both for the short term, but also for the long term? And indeed, who in organizations decides? Is it at the top? Is it at the bottom? Is it the middle? Or is it indeed a community of leadership all over the organization? And in many respects, my work with DBJ is around creating the space for those conversations that we can think in a very radical way about what the future might look like. One of the interesting pieces of research that we did during the pandemic was around this idea of the leadership conversation. How often and how well are leaders talking about issues relating to alignment? Issues such as, what is our purpose? How well is that purpose understood and meaningful for those within our organization and outside? What is our strategy? Which choices have we made about how it is that we are trying to perform our purpose in the context of the market opportunity and threat? How capable are we as an organization? And what might we need to change about our people or our culture or our structure in order to become capable in a different way that represents a more sustainable model? And the results to me were fascinating. We surveyed 80 leading large organizations, and what they revealed is that often leaders of organizations, and this is top management, simply do not have the opportunity to discuss these issues of alignment as much as they wish. The blue shows how often, from never to once a year, to once a month, to once a week, to every day, how often top leaders discuss issues of purpose, strategy, and organization. And the green represents how much ideally and how frequently they would ideally like to discuss these things. And the results are very interesting. Many never discuss it. The most discuss it once a year, or at most once a month. Ideally, these are conversations that should take place much more frequently. Then the interesting question becomes, why are leaders not discussing these issues as frequently as they wish? Bearing in mind this is a multi-sector survey. So not one sector, but global organizations in many different sectors. And the reality is, I think, 3 particular pressures. Number 1, performance pressure, the delivery of results. They are very focused on execution. Issue number 2, often misaligned organizations experience the most number of problems that distract from being able to focus on strategic issues. So many leaders pulled into tactical, transactional, operational issues and do not have the time or the bandwidth to focus on the more important strategic conversations. But the third, and for me, the most interesting aspect or finding was that often the conversations are not happening as much as they should simply because leaders did not have a framework for how to have the conversation. Even if they have the time, even if they have the urgency, they simply do not have the means, the conceptual framework for how to engage in a conversation about purpose, strategy, about alignment, about whether or not we are, as a business, fit for purpose within the context of our customers and our competitors, and indeed disruptions within our environment. So in many respects, Align, Realign, and now Realign Japanese edition were attempts to create that conceptual framework, that intellectual toolkit, that process by which leaders of organizations could come together and have meaningful conversations. It does not give the answer, but rather it provides the questions and the frameworks by which leaders can achieve their own answers. One of the most important frameworks is what's referred to as the strategic alignment framework. And for me, this is really the heart of the book, because this is what connects our different aspects of alignment and provides that golden thread through which leaders can think of their own organization, think about how it is currently, and think about how it should be in the future. It is a way of trying to navigate complexity, to make it more simple, but also to provide leaders of organizations with a common language so that they can engage with each other to have a more robust leadership conversation. So the next part, I will confess, is a little bit heavy. So please, I hope, even though it is quite late in the day, you are a little bit genki, because I need you to listen for this next part. It is a little bit heavy, but it serves a purpose. It lets us try and navigate the different models that ultimately define our business environment and the options that we have for them. What we can see through the research that went into this book is that there are a number of different requirements placed upon organizations, the first of which is a continuing market requirement for stability and for autonomy. Stability provides organizations with the capability to maximize economies of scale, to predictably match supply and demand, to inject consistency and standardization into their operations. Autonomy gives us speed, it gives us simplicity in organizations, and it allows organizations to operate and focus on their own products and services independent of having to rely upon anybody else. We see that many organizations, despite this narrative about shifting away from industrial age thinking, still conform to this model, this product leadership model. We call these the efficiency maximizers. And a great example of this type of organization is one that I talk about a lot, because everywhere you go in the world, everybody has heard of it. It is, of course, McDonald's. How is it possible for a company to serve 70 million plus customers every single day of the year, every year for the last 70 years, and remain market leader? How is it possible for a company to have more than 38,000 restaurants, more than 1.4 million employees, more than 25 billion in annual revenues, and indeed to operate in 160 countries. What makes that possible as consistent market-leading performance? Actually, there's a set of very clear criteria that we associate with this type of model of organization. They typically emphasize the maximizing of economies of scale through superior and highly efficient execution. They're highly process-driven, highly routine-driven. There's clear hierarchical working structures, a great deal of vertical integration that's run through this hierarchy of decision-making that's very rational in design. There are highly elaborate processes. And we also have very high levels of teamwork, albeit localized, not necessarily collaboration across, but rather high levels of teamwork within. And it's also an example of top-down management control. One day, somebody in the audience will be from McDonald's and will maybe challenge what I say, but I would say McDonald's conforms to all of these characteristics. And these, in many respects, are the types of characteristics that we associate with the industrial age hierarchy, where you have typically a management population that do the thinking, then you have a worker population that do the doing, senior, middle, and relatively junior management. Conceptually, at least, this model remains viable and fit for purpose. And the key focus is around delivering economies of scale and efficiencies, matching relatively predictable demand with predictability of supply. But it's tough. This is a tough model. If we cannot manage costs, if we cannot deliver efficiencies, this is a model that can become very difficult to manage very quickly. There are also negatives in terms of it only really enables the development of commoditized products. And we see many organizations have sought to move away from that. One of the alternative options is to embrace this idea of agility. And agility is definitely a buzzword in management. We hear it all the time. Agility in this sense means organizations becoming more agile around customers, and in particular around the changing needs and preferences of customers, the ability to flexibly respond or to reconfigure our products and services to what customers are demanding, whether that is market customization or even extreme levels of customer personalization, where something is so utterly personalized that nothing else exists like it. We call these enterprising responders, and they win by responding better to the needs of markets and customers than their competitors. And typically they are highly agile, being able to reconfigure their services. They operate a hub and spoke working structure, so they're highly decentralized, and they employ very exploratory talent. A good example might be Coutts. Coutts is a British bank. It is the Bank of the King, and formerly his mother, the Queen of England. Coutts is not a standard B2C retail bank. You only really become interesting to Coutts if you have a lot of money. I do not have personal experience of this, but this is what I'm told. But the point is, if you had very high net worth, you would bank with Coutts because they offer a level of personalization of service that you would not get elsewhere. How does that become possible? Often it's by having highly enterprising talent at the point of customer interaction. A relatively weak center, maybe some shared balance sheet, maybe some administrative functions, but essentially this is a highly decentralized model in which there's high levels of local autonomy. If you wanted my perspective on which does, I will not generalize about universities, but my university, Oxford University, resemble, I would say it's something often like this, with high academic departments having high levels of freedom to innovate at the point at which work is performed. And we see this as a model that applies to many service industries, whether that's legal service, financial service, or consultancies. But again, it has advantages and it has disadvantages. One of which is there is often not very easy connection between these independent parts. So one alternative is to think, well, okay, what if we move north? One option is to think about connectivity as an aspect of how it is that we approach the marketplace, we approach capability, how it is that we try to differentiate ourselves or serve customers. We refer to these as portfolio integrators. The original book, Align, was published in 2019. But in 2013, I visited Keio University as a visiting professor, and indeed I worked with Professor Kaz Asakawa, who is here. He very kindly hosted me, and I presented BYD for the first time as a case study. And BYD was interesting at the time because in 2013, when I was visiting here in Tokyo at Hiyoshi, it had just received foreign direct investment from Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway. As a Chinese company at the time, most foreign investment was to create low-cost manufacturing operations. This was different. It was for the purpose of bringing together the three operating companies that fall under the BYD conglomerate umbrella. BYD, of course, as you will probably know, stands for Build Your Dreams, Build Your Dreams. BYD had operating companies in automotive, in semiconductor and solar panel, and also in mobile phone battery. In 2013, EV car technology and the EV car market is not what it is today. But this far-sighted investment in connecting together teams and technology from automotive, electronic, and battery to create a new market, new product, was extremely far-sighted. And 10 years later, in 2023, BYD has overtaken Tesla as the leading producer of electric vehicles, both cars and also the trucking industry, which is arguably the higher potential market. And this all happened in the last 10 years, not by investing in the acquisition of new resources, such as acquiring a company, but by investing in the connection or connecting existing resources that was already in the business. So we can see that in many respects, this idea of connectivity is about bundling together a diverse portfolio of offerings, finding synergies across organizations, across their different lines of business or their different geographies to be able to offer to the marketplace either nascent innovation or indeed a more comprehensive and integrated customer experience. In banking, one of the terms that we hear a lot is that of customer 360. And I will give myself as an example. I am both a personal banking customer, a business banking customer, a mortgage customer, a credit card customer, and a savings customer. And each of these individual products is handled by my bank by a different call center, using a different website for each one with different logins, of which I can only ever remember 2 and certainly not 5. As far as the bank is concerned, I am 5 separate customers, and it's deeply frustrating. The idea behind this portfolio integration approach is that we can connect across multiple different lines of business to focus around the one end user, the one customer. And if we can do that, then we can understand the entirety of their needs, and we can better align to them and offer them not simply a more comprehensive service, but we also have a better understanding of them as a customer. But that requires different things of us from an organizational perspective, that we have the ability to encourage collaboration between dissimilar parts of the same organization, that we have individuals who are both specialists but also generalists. They become T-shaped. That's rare talent and hard to develop. That we have a common language and culture that can encourage people to connect, and that we do not have necessarily the internal rivalry or the transaction costs that prevent collaboration. And we often see these taking the form of the quite classical matrix structure, but with high levels of empowerment for people to form spontaneous collaborations. Thank you, by the way, for your patience. We're almost there. This is a lot of information. Final category is this idea of embracing networks, in particular exploiting external resources, often through partnerships with other organizations, in order to be able to offer to our customers something that we could not if relying upon our own internal resources, whether that's our technologies or our people or our knowledge. So the idea of the platform-based strategy, for example, and we have examples of basic platforms such as Uber or, for example, Amazon, which, whilst they're incredibly complicated from a business model perspective, they simply more efficiently match supply and demand. But we see that there are other examples of this idea of exploiting networks and ecosystems for additional value. And one such example might be Arm, which of course is a Japanese company. Well, it's kind of a British company. Well, it's a little bit of both, really. And at one point, it almost became an American company. Arm was essentially a spin-out from the Cambridge cluster, the University of Cambridge cluster in the UK. Its technology resides in 95% of the world's smart devices, from phones to tablets to the Internet of Things. It does not manufacture chips, rather it designs them, and the manufacturing is performed through partnerships and through licensing with other organizations. Arm employs 7,500 people, and it's valued at something around 74 to 80 billion US dollars. It only employs 7,500 people, but it has 20,000 innovation partners, which as a network enable it to source and develop ever more innovative chip designs, ever more powerful and ever more low power consumption. And essentially what that looks like is something like, for example, Arm sitting above a network, and above that network being able to work with partners to draw upon their resources, to be able to forge connections between different partners, to be able to embed within its network variety that would be too costly to develop internally, but to then also leverage all of that capability and align it behind a customer opportunity or indeed some new form of innovation. This is probably the least well understood form of organization, but it offers huge potential in terms of the ability of organizations to not simply maximize scale, but to maximize economies of association, to be able to do different things and to offer to the marketplace novel solutions that competitors cannot emulate. But again, it requires a very different approach to how it is that we think about talent, how it is that we think about culture, how we manage complexity, but also how we think about leadership as well. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. Here we have essentially an attempt to draw a framework by which we can map our world of business and organizations. And there's a few important principles when you start to think in this way and start to understand that each one represents its own form of alignment. You see that we have different models that have different characteristics: formal, informal, centralized, decentralized, verticalized, horizontal, internal, external, and so on and so on and so on. You also start to appreciate that each has advantages and disadvantages. And when you start to understand that, then a question starts to emerge for which you already know the answer. And the question is, which is best? Which is best? If you ask my MBA students, they consistently say this one, because that's what they associate with Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. I'm sorry to say they are wrong. Which is best? It depends. It depends. It depends. And I think that, again, is the challenge. Part of the challenge is to accept that as attractive as this sounds, it does not work in every situation, and nor should it. And in fact, many organizations actually don't necessarily belong there. They should embrace other aspects because that's what's better fit for their purpose. That's what is better fit for their strategic context. So whilst there is no one organization model or approach that is best, there is a worst place, and the worst place is to be in the middle. Because again, a fallacy of thinking is that by being in the middle, for example, it means that we are the best of everything. We are efficient and flexible. We are simple, but also highly connected. No, it means that we are the jack of all trades and the master of none. We are not distinctively good at anything. So part of the leadership challenge is to understand ourselves, to make choices about which model works for us, and to push away from the center as much as possible to the edge in whichever direction is most appropriate for our circumstances, recognizing that there is an opportunity cost. The more efficient we become, the more stable, the less agile we are. So we better hope that this is the good strategic choice. The more autonomous we are, the less connected we can be. So in many respects, this is about leadership prioritization, differentiating between different options, and embracing the one that works best. We must recognize that often these are not simple choices. And in some cases, such as an organization like McDonald's, you can put an organization into one box. Many organizations, particularly diversified organizations, do not fit easily into one box. This is just one example from the banking sector, actually in the Middle East. And this was work I did with the executive committee of the bank. And it was a really fascinating experience, not least of which because when we were having these executive workshops, we reviewed how many products and services they offered, and we stopped counting at around about 20. Just simply too much. The second was to think, well, actually, let's use the framework to understand what do we look like today and what ideally should we look like in the future. And this uses the example of 3 lines of business: retail banking, corporate banking, and private client banking. And what this demonstrates is that actually, in order to be competitive in the future, the top team of this bank think that they have to significantly and radically realign their 2 greatest profit potential areas of business, corporate banking and private client banking, in particular to make them more connected and to make them more agile, to be able to offer customers more variety, but to also offer them a higher level of personalization of service, recognizing that that's not what they do at the moment. At the moment, they are not fit for purpose. At the same time, also recognizing that for their retail banking offering, actually in the next 5 to 10 years, that wouldn't necessarily need to change much at all. So this is an image of essentially painting a map of the organization, both in its current state and how it should be in the future, and recognizing that essentially it's an organization of 2 different approaches. One which is focused around efficiency, the other which is much more focused around innovation and the leveraging of external resources for the purpose of offering a radically different service. One final example of how this framework might be used is from the law firm sector. So I've had various non-executive directorships of law firms. This is not one of those firms. This is a firm where we did a piece of research. This involved quite forensic mapping using this framework of how this organization operated on the current basis. Again, with different areas of its business: the employment law practice, transactional legal services, and corporate law. The really interesting thing is that this represents an example of essentially this firm adopting a one-size-fits-all approach to these fundamentally different businesses with different client requirements that need to be run in very different ways. And actually, they're largely clustered around the center. So their their sort of transactional legal services weren't very efficient when they should be, very hard to scale. Their corporate law practice, which should have been highly customized and highly sensitive to the needs of big corporate clients, wasn't. All of it was essentially centered around the middle. And again, the question is why? Why? And in that respect, I think it would be a lack of strategic leadership to actually understand what is it that we need to win at, what is it that we need to be good at, and are we good? Are we good, and what is it that we need to change about it? So I'm going to start wrapping up, but there's some thoughts that I would like to leave you with. Simply some key takeaways from the book that I think are really important and that we don't talk about enough. Number one, and it was said earlier, the best aligned companies are the best performing. And in that respect, alignment, as I talked about it in relation to that continuum at the beginning, is a state of being. Organizations are either highly aligned or they are poorly aligned. If they are poorly aligned, they cannot be high performing. They simply cannot. So alignment is a state of being that we associate with performance. Realignment is a process that should be led either to overcome disruption or to improve performance. So it's the difference between a state of being versus the process to become. Either way, both require a strategic approach. So part of the reason why the book was written was to elevate this idea of alignment and realignment and to inject it back into the leadership discussion, because it's absolutely critical. Third point would be, as the strategic alignment framework hopefully illustrates, there is no one single simple solution that works in every situation. I wish there was, and I wish I was the author of it, because then, well, you know, it would be Nobel Prize time. But unfortunately, no such thing exists, and it would be wrong to think that it does. The challenge is, how do we decide what works for us in our specific context and over time? In that sense, alignment is fundamentally an aspect of competitive advantage. If we can lead alignment and realignment better than our competitors, it means that we will always have a competitive edge over them. So whether you are a private sector organization or a governmental organization, whether you are competing for market share or competing for resources, this really is a top priority. Fourth, many organizations might need to pursue multiple approaches simultaneously. Again, not only is there not one model, even within one organization, we may need many different models, many different approaches. So again, part of that leadership challenge is to become ambidextrous, to be able to juggle multiple competing demands, and not impose a one-size-fits-all or become caught in the middle by not making any decisions at all. Part of the leadership challenge for the 21st century must be to better manage variety, because our environment demands variety as well as integration. But variety equals complexity. The more things we're trying to succeed at, the more complex our organization must become. So therefore, the more sophisticated our leadership must be in order to be able to make better choices, to navigate that complexity, to navigate that uncertainty. So leadership development is something that I do as part of my job as a professor. And in many respects, I think there has not been as much innovation in the field of leadership development and human capital development as there should have been over the last 20 to 30 years. I think we're still catching up with the environment, which is changing so much and all the time because of technology. Maybe the final 2 points is really the message that I've been saying, that alignment equals performance, but that leadership equals alignment. And so really the quality of organizational leadership is absolutely critical. But this does not mean the sort of traditional Western model of heroic leadership of, can I say, Winston Churchill or perhaps Napoleon, the strategist looking from on top of the hill, operating with information and directing orders. I think leadership in the future will be as important as it ever has been, but it will take the form of systems leadership. Being able to collectively think of organizations as complex social systems and manage them and lead them and transform them and design them to be different on a collective basis, drawing upon the wisdom of the crowd, not just the one individual. So these are some of the considerations that really inform the key messages of the book. And the book is really intended to be not an academic theory book, but a book that provides a blueprint for people within companies or organizations to have conversations with their teams or to think differently. I would like to take the opportunity to say that this has been a tremendous experience working with many great people in order to make this book project come to reality. And by the way, when I initially wrote Realign, I had no expectation that it would ever be translated into Japanese. And I consider it a complete privilege and honor that it has been. And I'm so very flattered that we have this opportunity. I especially want to thank NTT Data Institute of Management Consulting, Yamaguchi-san, Orana-san, Ishizuka-san, but also Shun Fujioka and Shin Sakamoto. I wish to thank my good friend JJ, who, as he said, we've worked for a very long time, and this was a wonderful collaboration. I do want to thank very much the Development Bank of Japan, my long-standing partner, for being so supportive, including Mr. Jige, the president, but also Mr. Kobayashi as well, who very generously spoke earlier. I think it's also probably the person that maybe worked the hardest was the person who actually did the translation of the book, which is a very, very hard job. So I very much wish to thank Miss Ando, but also Kotaba Miki, who made the initial introduction to Ishizuka-san, but also to the publisher Toyo Keizai. But I must also say my publisher back in the UK, Bloomsbury, who are both delighted but also supported the process of this translation and this publication. So thank you for listening. I hope this gives you an insight into the book and some of its issues. And indeed, thank you so much for your attention. And thank you very much for this wonderful privilege and an opportunity. Domo arigatou gozaimasu. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Trevor, for the wonderful presentations. Now we'd like to move on to the Q&A session. And since many of the Japanese people are so modest, we have asked the questions beforehand. And so would you kindly answer those? We have about 3 or 4 questions on the screen. And the first question is, can I say that in Japanese?
Please, please.
ジョン・ P. コッターのデュアル OS や両機器の経営との関連性、融合についてお伺いしたいです。How do you answer that?
Well, firstly, I'm very delighted to see Realign in the same sentence as John Cotter's Dual OS. That is very high praise. I think there is very much a relationship. And I think one of the interesting things about alignment doesn't necessarily mean integration. And I think a lot of people think that it does. Integration is a form of alignment. What is equally important for alignment is separation. If we integrate business units, for example, within an organization when they should be kept separate, it creates misalignment. If we don't integrate business units when they should be brought together for the purpose of synergy, it creates misalignment. So in many respects, for me, integration is a way of, simply one way of either creating alignment or not. It's one tool. I think the key word here is ambidexterity. And ambidexterity simply means the ability for an organization to both deliver results in a highly efficient a maximizing way, whilst at the same time also innovating, which is inherently an inefficient process, and build capability for tomorrow to both exploit and explore simultaneously. And I think Realign articulates, particularly in terms of the strategic alignment framework, a way to think about organizations being ambidextrous. It says, for example, that in the bottom left-hand corner, that is absolutely the exploiting phase. But when you start to move outside of the bottom left-hand corner, you fundamentally get into activity which is less about exploiting and much more about exploring either new customer opportunity, new synergy or collaboration opportunity, or new partner opportunity. So it's the ability of organizations to, again, be able to accommodate multiple different models simultaneously and not lose their coherence, to not lose alignment. That doesn't mean imposing one size fits all. It means managing an organization and spinning multiple plates at the same time. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And the next question is, アライメントを難しくしている本質とは何でしょうかということです。
Wow.
Wow.
I think partly what makes the essence, which is the question, of alignment difficult is actually a philosophy problem. In philosophy, it is said that there are essentially two realities. And I am not a philosophy professor, so please do not quote me. I'm humble business and management, but I have an interest. Physical reality and social reality. Physical reality is the reality that exists independent of how we think about it. It just is. Social reality exists only because we have a commitment to it or a belief in it, and in doing so, we bring it to life. Organizations only exist because we believe that they do. We bring them into existence through an act of intellectual creation and belief. Belief in their values, a belief in their substance, a belief in their reality. In other words, when we stop or cease to exist, all organizations that have ever been created will cease with us, as will the history of them. And I think that's part of the challenge, is that there is very little about organizations which is objectively true consistently always. Much of it depends upon how we view them. Much of the nature of organization depends upon the assumptions that we bring to them, both assumptions that we understand, that are obvious, but also assumptions which are taken for granted and may be unconscious. So organizations are inherently about people and how those people think about them, and what that then produces as the social reality, the socially constructed reality, which is another way of saying that if left to their own devices, organizations, because they are made up of people, will naturally want to misalign. Organizations and their people naturally want to fall apart. It's almost a little bit like the physics notion of entropy. Organizations naturally lose energy unless we work hard as leaders to bring them back and establish a sense of common purpose, establish a shared set of assumptions and priorities and principles that people commit to and buy into and want to enact, want to implement. If we do not actively manage the process of alignment, because organizations are about people, the people will naturally do their own thing. So it's always, I think, a political process, I have to say, of really creating that sustainable social system, which really is, I think, comes back to that first slide, about always trying to push to the left-hand side of that continuum and away from the right-hand side, because organizations naturally want to migrate to the right-hand side, particularly when they become large and particularly when they become complex. So I would say that's the essence for me. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Because the time is limited, next one will be the last question. 事業戦略と組織アーキテクチャをつなぐ際の留意点とはどのようなことがありますでしょうか？
I think this is a really good question. Because in many respects, and this is a key feature in the book, every organization, whether it's public sector, private sector, whether it's small or large, whether it's British or Japanese, domestic or multinational, every organization is a value chain that essentially consists of purpose, the reason why it exists, its strategy, how it's intending to go about to fulfill that purpose in the environment, and then a series of organizational choices, especially about people and about culture and about structure. What does the right structure look like for us, for example? And the element that moderates all of those relationships and all of those choices sits at the heart of that value chain in the middle, and that is the idea of organizational capability. So I think many folk in many organizations are focused on strategy, or they're focused on HR, or they're focused on operations, or they're focused on production, or they're focused on IT. Actually, something that should be of equal concern for everybody should be this idea of organizational capability. What is it that we need to be capable of, good at as an organization in order to implement our chosen strategy? And that requires joined up conversations by everybody, leadership at all levels, in order to really make good choices about that and then to implement it. So for me, there's often a missing link in terms of how we think about the corporate value chain, and it is this issue of capability. I think that's the really critical connecting part.
Okay, thank you very much for the insight. And the time flies so fast, and now we have to move on to the next session.
はい、ではこれより、政府の活用とリアライメントについてのパネルディスカッションを、行いたいと思います。このセッションは英語で進行させていただきますので、あらかじめご了承ください。From now, we would like to start the panel discussion regarding how to utilize SAF and drive the alignment. Please note that this session will be conducted in English. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. Today's agenda is consisted of 4 parts. Starting from self-introduction and sharing issues by 2 panelists, and Professor Trevor will share the several cases in the Western companies. And the panelists will discuss how to accelerate DX using SF. Finally, the discussion will be concluded. Let me introduce the 3 panelists. First panelist is Dr. Jonathan Trevor, professor of Oxford University Side Business School. And the next, Mr. Keiichi Ueda from ANA, Vice President Digital Transformation Innovation. And Mr. Dai Uran from NTT Data Institute of Management Consulting, Representative Director and Executive Managing Director. And finally, I'm Takuya Endo from NTT Data Institute of Management Consulting. Will be moderating this session. Okay, let's move on to the introduction part by Uran-san and Wen-san. Over to you, Uran-san.
Thank you, Endo-san. Hello, everyone. I'm Dai Urano from NTT Data Management Consulting. Since I have been working in the IT and consulting industry for almost 30 years, so I have a long experiences as a business consultant in portfolio integrator, defined in SAF, which is a cross between vertical industry and horizontal offering to provide value to clients. In the IT industry, central government system, banking system, card processing system, and telecommunication systems, which are called in mission critical system, require high quality and high reliability. So I think, they are positioned in efficiency maximizer quadrant, operated as economies of scale, organized hierarchical organization with standardized business processes, organizational capability to build these robust IT systems with high quality is our strength. It's very, very important to continue to strengthen them as a social infrastructure. In addition, in order to respond in detail to the individual requirements of specific large-scale enterprise clients, we need to read clients in the enterprise responder quadrant, which is customer-driven. I believe we have an advantage in this quadrant as well, in terms of listening to clients' specific requirements and responding with flexible deliverables in order to achieve clients' business outcomes. Many people, especially Japanese in Japan say that Japanese companies are behind in digital transformation compared with Western companies. But is it true? I believe that Japanese enterprises have strengths in at least two quadrants, efficiency maximizer and enterprise responder. On the other hand, the quadrants of portfolio integrator and network exploiter, network exploiter required in recent digital transformation is historically unfamiliar with traditional large-scale Japanese companies. At first, portfolio integrator, top on the left, quadrant required generating synergies through agile business operations and collaboration with other companies across organizations by combining advanced technology and services. As a management consulting firm, we NTT Data Management Consulting has been strengthened in this quadrant by combining vertical industry and horizontal offering knowledge. Lastly, network exploiter quadrant leverages networks to create new business models through ecosystems, required network type organizational operations based on collaboration and organizational structure on the network side. This quadrant requires high agility and connectivity. So collaboration with other companies, outside companies, is very important. But I think that traditional Japanese companies are struggling in this quadrant.
Hi. Thank you, Urano-san. Will-san, please. Thank you. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're energetic enough to, keep going on. And let me introduce myself. I'm from ANA, and since I joined ANA in 1990, I had many opportunity to participate in the edge cutting technology project, and mainly around airport, internet check-in, self-service product, and blah, blah, blah. And also I'm happy to participate in several important, events such as vaccine transportation, before I came to this position, this April. Okay, talking about ANA, maybe we are one of the airline in Japan. And the mission of ANA is, yes, safety comes first. Okay, we have to keep focus on flight safety. It's easy to imagine. And we also need to focus on on-time performance because that is our main product. And yes, of course, we want to make you feel comfortable. So we want to stabilize the services. That's our competence. So we should say we need to have a good competence in this dimension, efficiency maximizer. However, it's not easy to stay in the market without improving our services. So we have to look at the customer experiences. We need to, be quick enough to catch the needs and the response to the customer needs. That is something we need to do with the enterprise and responder area. So you can imagine last 5 years, the context dramatically changes for everybody. ANA is not the exception. So pre-COVID period, there are good mood looking for the big demand in World Cup, Rugby World Cup 2019, and also we are expecting huge people coming in for Tokyo Olympic 2020. So we are gradually, preparing for that. However, we need to, change because of the COVID situation. It's pretty easy for you to understand that there was no passenger demand after it started. So we have to face, what do we do? How do we survive without moving passenger? So we need to start thinking of, what about cargo? By using passenger aircraft. What about the other entertainment which we all already have? So we try to find some on-ground entertainment. Maybe in the in the news network that ANA Group company provided some in-flight meal services subscription, such as travel contents in YouTube and blah blah blah. And we need to work on the cost reduction, cutting out sources, and we are happy that we're quite lucky that there were so many companies which welcome our frontline staff such as CAs, cabin attendants, and the people who work in the airport. So we need to keep changing dramatically to cope with the latest situation. And after that, COVID has gone, past COVID, we still face some drastic change. There are emerging passenger demand. However, we see some people is not coming back to where they were. So we have to minimize that gap between demand and supply. So we need to find a way to cope with this situation. So we are, still keep trying to working on to cope with this situation. So at this moment, we need to, incorporate the disruptive innovations such as creative AI to minimize the gap. So we try to be, playing a role of a network exploiter. That's something we are working on. It's our new challenge.
Okay, thank you, Wilson. Now let's move on to the case sharing part by Dr. Trevor. How Western company utilize the SAF? Over to you.
Yeah.
Doctor.
Thank you so much. So I do not intend to present any slides. I think I have done enough already. But I would like to maybe share with you some stories, which I think also speak to what we have heard already. I think there's a number of different examples that you can identify where companies, when using the SAF, would locate themselves in the bottom left-hand corner, which is to say that their traditional approach, where they have come from, where they have focused on in the past, has been on efficiency, or even if not necessarily efficiency, they have organized in such a way that would be characteristic of that efficiency approach. So, for example, they often have hierarchy, or they have formal process, or they have a leadership model that drives from the top down. And I think one scenario that you can see, particularly in very competitive industries, competitive around cost, but also competitive in the sense of limited market growth opportunity, you see a real move away from this traditional hierarchical approach towards something which is either more customer-centric or more synergistic, or this combination of both agility and connectivity by utilizing external resources. In that particular situation, I think what is very hard for companies is to engage in that realignment process in one step. Particularly moving from bottom left to top right is like me trying to swim from Tokyo to London. It's just too much. Rather, what I see a lot of companies doing is, in fact, saying, well, if we need to be diagonal, we should not do it in one go. We should first either embrace agility and then connectivity, or connectivity and then agility, not necessarily both at the same time, because it's simply too much in terms of organizational change. So I think digital transformation has a key part to play in change, transformation, and realignment, but so do other elements as well, including, I think, particularly non-technology elements around people and culture and ways of working. And often those softer elements of organization are what prevent successful transformation. And I think making that diagonal jump is, from a, for example, human resources or a culture perspective, often too much. So I think a more realistic approach is to almost have a two-phased realignment approach. That is one scenario. I think there are other examples where companies, well, let me give you an example confidentially. I will not mention the name, but I'm working with an organization at the moment that is a conglomerate. And in many respects, they remind me a little bit of General Electric. And we talked a little bit about where I found the inspiration to do this work when I was younger. And if you were to ask my MBA student today, who do you admire most? Same answers, always Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg. But when I was younger, not too long ago, but younger, it was not Steve Jobs, it was Jack Welch. And the company that was admired was not Apple or Google or Tesla, it was GE. And I think if you look at GE today, it's a very different organization. Arguably, I would say GE is quite a famous example of the portfolio integrator, having multiple separate lines of business, everything from aerospace engines to light bulbs to healthcare to finance. And having the GE way, a set of processes and a set of methods that would apply across those different areas. But I think like many conglomerates, including the one I'm working with, managing that portfolio and managing the synergies between them is incredibly hard, especially in a more complex and dynamic environment. And if you look at GE today, it's worth considerably less in terms of market value than it was 20, 25 years ago. And of course, it is no longer the GE that we know. It is split into 3 companies. If you look at IBM, it has gone through a transition again away from hardware managed services to now focusing exclusively on technology and consulting. So I see organizations which are in the bottom left trying to embrace that network exploiter future. I see a lot of complex organizations actually trying to become more simple through portfolio management, by divesting businesses, or by focusing on simplicity. So I think it's a very dynamic picture, and it's wrong to say that organizations will always gravitate towards more connectivity and more agility, because I think the data just does not support that. Small is beautiful in many respects.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. And let's move on to discussion. How we should accelerate the DX using SF. They're particularly focusing on 3 parts: organization capability and organization architecture and management systems. And regarding organization capability, Ueda-san and Ron-san have the different questions. So the first question from Ueda-san, over to you.
That, it's not objective. This is the way how we promote the change, promote, to have a sustainability for the company. So, and also, if we talk about the purpose of, enterprise, ANA has a purpose to enrich people's experience and society by air transportation. That's the common sense. And looking back at the last 5 years, we just need to respond some business alignment context. So I just want to go back and review what we have been through, and going, then we go to the questions. All right. So regarding the 5 years, okay. In the Olympic, World Cup era, we have to think about how we make the growth. This is something about the conceptual driven alignment. There is a dramatic expansion of business, so we need to think about how we align the context. And after we see COVID comes in, okay, we have to dramatically change. Obviously, otherwise we can survive. So we have to face innovative alignment, the aligned context. So what we did is downsizing, and we try to find a revenue besides the airline core businesses. And again, once post-COVID, we have to recap that we see there are so many people who is not willing to come back. So we also face again the innovative alignment, and by doing so, we try to maximize the power of DX to minimize the impact. That's what we are doing, and this this is the latest context, and the question will be how we can be best changing our, organization, KPI, to get along to the, these drastic change of business environment. That is my question.
Thank you, Ueda-san. The next.
We integrate value and respect organizational capability in the efficiency maximizer quadrant, which is necessary for existing large-scale mission-critical IT systems as our unique strengths. But in order to generate new business or transform existing businesses, leveraging digital technologies, we have created separate special zone organization and changed our management method and report line and human resource development as well. Although transformation of digital technology is relatively easy to change, but the critical issues to truly transformation are the change of business process, organizational culture, and people. Herein lies the difficulty of managing multiple business models within a single company. So Jonathan often says that Japanese companies are not unique, but Japanese companies are not able to drastically replace personnel due to legal restrictions. Retraining employees while maintaining employment is a major management issue for Japanese companies. What are your thoughts on this point?
Thank you very much. So I think there's a number of important points here. Firstly, I think when you think about those different models, efficiency, customer, synergy, network, it's tempting to think that the three which are not so traditional, not so much about efficiency, not so much about hierarchy, are the most innovative. And I don't think that's true. I think there is innovation in every quadrant, but the innovation serves different purposes. In the bottom left, innovation is how do we become more efficient, even more than we are already? How do we become even more consistent, even more reliable? I think bottom right, innovation is how do we become even closer to the customer? How do we have even more customer insight so that we can tailor our service? I think top left, innovation is how do we form collaborations more easily? How can we take combinations and create really exciting products and services that have not been developed before? And I think innovation top right is partner innovation. How can we partner with an external organization to do something that would be impossible otherwise? And competitors cannot easily copy or emulate. So for me, innovation exists in all of those different quadrants. And the role of digital transformation is to support not only change, but that sustainable innovation. But it has to have a target. It has to serve a purpose. I think digital transformation is like alignment. It doesn't just mean one thing in context. In context, it means many different things. So we need a strategic perspective on that. And I think with regards to barriers to change, clearly, I think there are unique challenges according to certain industries or even certain geographies. And it may be that there are labor law challenges that mean that Japanese organizations can't necessarily be as flexible as they might want. But let me tell you, if we were sitting in the United Kingdom, we would be having the exact same conversation. I think these are genuinely global issues around how do you manage talent? How do you integrate human capability with technological capability? I think that's the new frontier. That's not just a conversation about ChatGPT, but it is a conversation about increasingly augmenting human performance, both cognitive work and manual work with technology in whatever form that comes. But I think there's another key aspect, and this comes back to the leadership point, how, whether you are a Japanese company, American company, British company, how can we encourage the human resources department to work more closely with the technology function? How can we encourage the technology function to work more closely with the real estate function? How can we encourage the real estate function to work more closely with operations? This functional integration, whilst maintaining specialization, is, I think, one of the biggest barriers to effective change. We simply operate in too much in independent ways when actually we should be joined up to create alignment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And the next topic is the management systems. And this topic, they have a common question. So, Uran-san, could you tell?
Okay, let me explain management system issue. In the 4 quadrants of strategic alignment framework, which completely different in nature, as you mentioned, how do we manage KPI, compensation such as salary or promotion, resource allocation and management, etc., as a management control mechanism? Do you have advice for Japanese people?
Simple answer. Very carefully. Again, I think there's 2 aspects to this. One is the design, and the second is the implementation. And I think in terms of the design, this is not a comment on Japanese companies, but on Western companies more particularly. In terms of design, we see in business and management that there are very strong trends or fashion that become dominant, but are not necessarily always fit for the context into which they apply completely. You've got the term compensation down. In fact, funnily enough, compensation was the focus of my doctorate. And what is astonishing when you look at compensation structures, whether it is base salary, bonus incentives, or stock options, share options, or some form of long-term incentive, when you look across an entire industry, you start to see that competing organizations, particularly those which are publicly owned in the West, and these include many global brands, they pay their people in ways which are far more similar than different, even though they should be pursuing differentiated strategies. So there's often a disconnection between how we manage and how it is that we're trying to compete. And that disconnection is a feature of misalignment, but it also creates misalignment. How we pay our people, or how we train our people, develop them, how we performance manage our people, how we allocate work, how we set goals fundamentally impacts not just how hard our people work, but how they work, ways of working. And ways of working must support this idea of the value chain that is behind every part of, or behind every organization. So we could have a very long conversation about which compensation system is right for each quadrant. We don't have enough time. My recommendation is please read the book. That's a more efficient solution. But the reality is, I think we need to make sure we choose the appropriate design. We need to work out what is best for us, not what is popular in Harvard Business Review or management books. And we must also then make sure that we implement that well. And typically, in a lot of these issues, implementation is not done by central departments. It's done by line management. So the quality of management must be itself aligned, I think. You agree? Yeah. So happy.
Okay, thank you.
I have an additional question. You mentioned not central management, but
Line management.
line management. Okay, I could understand.
Okay, thank you. The last topic is organizational architecture. The question will be given by Ran-san as well.
This is the final question, I think. The use of digital technologies is essential as a key change driver, recent digital era. When we are using SAF methodology, SAF framework, to drive transformation initiative, I would like to understand how to deploy change management team in the company to lead the transformation. For example, Center of Excellence or change management team in each division, and so on.
Gosh, I think it's a very good question, but fortunately there is an easy answer. It depends. I think, again, it's partly the nature of the change. You could imagine within the SAF that cycles of change are themselves dependent upon which quadrants. So typically, as the name or as the dimension would imply, stable organizations change less than agile organizations. So I think even how we approach the topic of change, where that change is located, who has the authority, even that needs to be thought of in a very customized way. I don't think there is a generic prescription for how to organize the change process that will work in every situation. And if I can say that, I think creates maybe the final point that is worth noting. Each quadrant represents a series of choices. Each quadrant determines how people working within that quadrant will work, how they will see their priorities, how they will define their performance, how they will try to develop the capabilities and the proficiency. What is required is a leadership function that can zoom out and look down on all quadrants and start to make those architectural choices about what good looks like, how we support change between quadrants, not just within, how we think about alignment across the whole enterprise, so enterprise-wide. And I don't think that leadership function that can zoom out is just necessarily only senior management. I worked with an organization recently that created a transformation team that was voluntary. It was open to people from all levels in the organization to join. You had to apply like it was a job, and it almost became like a transformation think tank, albeit internally. And its job was to influence how leaders, operational leaders in the organization think, to encourage them to think differently. And I think that can be very powerful. That was non-hierarchical. It was not about senior executive responsibility. It was about just simply creating the space to ask the fundamental questions and maybe have some crazy conversations that would eventually lead to something quite innovative, maybe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the closing time is coming. So we would like to wrap up this discussion. Final conclusion will be spoken in Japanese by Rana-san.
Thank you, Jonathan. There are many aspects, too many aspects for us. So it's very difficult to conclude simple word. So ですね、もう日本語の皆さんなんで日本語でお話ししますけど、私自身ももう今日の本当の気づきは、どうしてもフォークアドラントをまとめようっていう思想がやっぱり頭の中にどうしてもあるんですけど、やっぱりさっきイノベーションも4象限で違う、ことが起きると。左下は効率化だし、右下は、カスタマードリブンだし、左上は、コラボレーションの、結果でイノベーション起きるし、右上はもうパートナーシップドリブンだという、もう違うということを前提にして、それぞれの、エンタープライズパーパス、ストラテジー、オーガニゼーショナルケーパビリティ、アーキテクチャ、マネジメントシステムを、すべてアライメントしていくっていうことは、非常に難しいんですけど、やっぱり個々の事業体の、特性によって、一つの会社で一つのモデルっていう考えはやっぱり捨ててですね、俯瞰するレベルはもうシニアレベルだけだという話もしてましたので、そういう皆様のご参加いただいた、マネジメントのレベルに合わせて、このぜひ SAF を使って、マネジメントしていただければと思っています。やはり結論としては It depends. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 皆様ありがとうございました。改めて大きな拍手をお願いいたします。